What a marvelous view I have looking at you all. I'm Philip Kunhardt. I am the director of NYU's Center for the Study of Transformative Lives. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you here tonight for this marvelous evening. How good to have Stacy Schiff and John Matteson and Ron Chernow with us tonight. What an abundance of riches. Yeah. And thank you all for being here, because I think it's quite a special audience we have tonight. Some of you are neighbors and close friends. Others are new to these events. But all of us have been drawn together because of an intense love and interest in the understanding of human lives. My co-sponsoring organization, NYU's Biography seminar, consists of professional and academic biographers who meet regularly to discuss each other's work and support one another in their art and practice of biography. The center, in a somewhat different focus, exists to bring lives and their study more explicitly into the academic arena, particularly in their capacity to inspire students and members of the public who are hungry for life models. This is actually an old concept. The study of lives is part of the life-building project. How both positive and negative examples, carefully considered, can help people navigate their own complex lives. My hope is that after a deep exposure over the course of a semester, my students will never forget the person they have studied, that he or she, flaws and all, will become a touch point in their lives. Speaking of her departed friend and mentor, Karl Jaspers, Hannah Arendt once said, "Every so often, someone emerges among us who realizes human existence in an exemplary way and is the bodily incarnation of something we would otherwise know only as a concept or ideal. Earthly humans need bodily existence, for only that guarantees that what was real in one person should also be possible for everyone else." I like that. So it was natural that my center and I, with our deep interest in learning from lives, should find our way to NYU's 30-year-old biography seminar. For biographers are those who study lives most deeply, spending years immersed in their subjects until they understand them in their bones, each biographer in his or her own way. I'd like to thank Anne Heller, the upcoming biographer of Hannah Arendt, for her enormous role in tonight's event, and also her colleague at the biography seminar, Charles DeFonte. Also Caitlin Hurst, who welcomed you here tonight at the desk, the center's assistant director. And to all friends and supporters who are here, I want to thank you profoundly. The center needs allies and partners to make this dream an ongoing reality. Our moderator tonight is a distinguished biographer himself of the poet Delmore Schwartz and of the American novelist Saul Bellow. He is a legendary editor and publisher who has worked for The New Yorker, the New York Times Book Review, and other distinguished journals. And he was the creator and editor of The Penguin Lives, one of my favorite series, also of HarperCollins's Eminent Lives, and now a new series of short biographies for Amazon Publishing. He's currently writing a book on his life in the world of biography, provocatively titled, I think, Jim, The Shadow in the Garden?
Yes, that's right.
Thank you.
Biographer's Tale.
A biographer's tale. James will introduce our esteemed panelists and then guide us through a series of questions that will keep us focused on the evening's topic. Is biography true? What is the relationship between the life lived and the life written. It's going to be fun. And so I give you our moderator, my friend and colleague, James Atlas.
So, Philip, I was going to thank all the people who you thanked, so I'll just focus on you instead. But Philip has created something that all writers and scholars aspire to create, and that is this hive of activity at NYU called the Center for Transformative Lives, which has, you didn't emphasize enough, I think, the theme of uplift that determines the choices of people in history who you have focused on, like Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King. If I had a center like yours, I think it would have a very different focus, and that my transformative lives would be Beckett and Kafka. but that's one reason why I like to be around you, is that you're inspiring in that way and positive. So I have managed to hook up with Philip here. I'm very lucky that I did. This event, you can hardly imagine. He's incredibly, I was going to say insanely, but I'll just say incredibly detail-oriented. And what you see here as a room of chairs and some more chairs up here and tables has actually taken months to figure out how this all works. I know more about platform than I do about biography, their size and the cost and how it all works. But it is a joint venture, and the biography seminar, which is actually 40 years old, not 30 years old, even more venerable than we would imagine, is a group I've fortunately stumbled on over the last couple years, where biographers are brought in out of the cold to sit around and talk about their works in progress, and it's very nurturing, because, as you can imagine, biography is really an isolating task, where we spend months and years in our libraries, in our rooms, not working and not talking to anyone, and then we get to go to the biography seminar, and it's a satisfying experience. So tonight we have 3 panelists, all of whom, I can just say this once, so I don't have to say it 3 times, are Pulitzer Prize winners. We only have Pulitzer Prize winners on our panels. And so you all made the cut there. Congratulations. And they're on the fast track, too. They are, in fact, not just sitting in the library. Ron Chernow here, whose book, Biography of Hamilton, has turned into this incredible hit, headed for Broadway, a hip-hop musical. That's what you intended, right, when you wrote the book? I tried to write this book for 10 years just so I could get made into a... But actually, I've heard gossip that you're at the theater every night, so we're lucky to...
Yeah, almost every night. And I promise I'll try not to lapse into hip-hop this evening, although it may be slightly difficult, given my life at the moment, but I'll do my best.
And Stacy, whose last book, Cleopatra, is in development with Angelina Jolie, whose medical problems you could read about in today's paper. And so that's Angelina Jolie and Broadway, and John Matteson, author of the biography of Margaret Fuller. I'm sure you're going to tell me that's going to be a mini-series starring Reese Witherspoon.
I think I'm the Ringo Starr of this quartet, actually, but still glad to be up here.
Anyway, they're all big stars. I'm very honored to have them here. And our initial question about is biography true, is so taxing that I'm going to just shelve it for a minute and ask each of them if they would talk briefly about how they got into this peculiar profession and how you're going to get out of it. No, how it's developed over the years in your thinking. So maybe you could begin, Stacy.
Do you think I should use the microphone?
Sure.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Jim. Thank you all for coming. There are a lot of biographers in this audience. So I'm just going to go out on a limb and wager that no one ever sits on the stoop as a child and says, I'm going to be a biographer when I grow up. I mean, I certainly didn't. I still want to be an architect or a rockette. And I think I came to biography mostly from the love of reading biography. I like to read history through the lens of a sensibility, if not a personality. And there's a wonderful quote of Ad Reinhardt's where he essentially says that sculpture is the thing you trip over when you're looking at paintings in a museum. And I feel like he says it a little more delicately, actually a little more demeaningly. And I feel like biography is the same kind of thing. The personality that lifts from the page when you're reading history is what always had enchanted me. That's from a writerly point of view. That's from a readerly point of view. From a writerly point of view, you know, what people say about cats is kind of true about biographers. The biographer is never alone. You're always in communion with some, whether you want to be or not, in communion with some other sensibility and some other life. And you're possessed in some way by a different perspective. Sometimes that makes you want to slit your wrist, but it's a sort of fascinating dual vision, and I've really thrilled to that at all times. It's a way to sort of pretend to anyway understand a life, because of course you know you have no hope of understanding your own. There are two other things I guess I would say are gratifying to me anyway about writing biography. One is that there's a very clear beginning, middle, and an end. And I've tended, as I've gone on, to disregard that more and more, but there is an inherent structure to the sport. And the other gratification, I think we can all agree, is that unlike most other disciplines, you in the end get to kill off your hero in the end.
Oh, can I say that for a second? Sorry. When you memorize your remarks, you tend to forget certain things that are very important. I sound like the Academy Awards here, a speech, but I did want to make sure that Anne Heller was specifically thanked, though she was mentioned by Philip, for the work she's done here in creating this program. She's really my co-partner with the biography seminar. And also John Maynard, who is our director, but he happens to be on a Greek isle now. This is why people go into academic life. But so anyway, that is done, and I feel better, and let's on with the show.
Let me use this again.
Yeah, kind of like Stacy, I look out over the audience and I see so many wonderful biographers in the audience. I feel that we could trade places with about half the audience, so we all feel a little bit humble sitting up here tonight. I agree with what you said, Stacy, that I think in the lives of most biographers there was a large element of happenstance and accident that led to their becoming biographers. You know, in my case, I knew from the time that I was a teenager that I wanted to be a writer, but I thought I was going to be a fiction writer, and I was just saying to John that I did 2 degrees in English literature, and I never took a single history course. The reason being I was always taking a course in the novel, usually the 18th or 19th century novel, with these gigantic reading lists, and history courses had gigantic reading lists, and so I could never see how I could take them at the same time. So for better or for worse, everything that I've written about has been self-taught. But when I got out of school, I started working as a freelance magazine writer, but I was always scribbling short stories, nights and weekends, which never got published, but I persisted in that error for many years. And then what happened, I think when I started writing my first book, The House of Morgan, all of the years that I had spent thinking about narrative, you know, the basic elements of fiction, whether it was voice, pacing, point of view, portraiture, etc., all of it flowed quite naturally into biography. So I suspect that a lot of biographers are actually, like me, novelists manqués.
Yeah, it's always seemed to me that I didn't really find biography. It's more as if biography found me. I, back 14 years ago, was just an assistant professor at John Jay College who'd written an article in NEQ about something that had nothing to do with biography. And I got a phone call from a literary agent. He said, "Hi, my name's Peter Steinberg, and I've read your article, and I'd like to explore representing you for a nonfiction book." And so all of a sudden, here I am. I'm like Lana Turner. I've been discovered in the diner, and said, "Well, that's great, but I have no idea what you would want me to write about because I'm writing literature articles and trying to teach 4 classes a semester." He says, "Oh, don't worry, come to lunch. We'll work it out." And we came away from that lunch with the idea that I would write a book about 19th century utopian communities. It was something that just kind of interested me, and the first one that I started researching was Fruitlands, which was founded by or co-founded by Bronson Alcott. And I thought, this is great because I know he wrote journals from the time he was 25 until the time he had a stroke at 82 and couldn't write anymore. And so these journals on Fruitlands are just going to be amazing. I'm going to look at those. My life will be easy. I get up to the Houghton Library at Harvard and discover that the Fruitlands journals have been lost. Oh. Okay, so now already there's a huge hole in my topic, but I started reading around in the other years of Bronson Alcott journals. I thought, this guy's fascinating. So I went back to the agent and said, I'm not going to write the Utopia book. I'm going to write a biography of Bronson Alcott. He said, okay, fine. I don't know who he is, but if you say so. But then the real inspiration hit me, and it actually dates back to when I was in grad school. I came back to graduate school very late, and as I was getting ready to take my orals, I became a dad. This wonderful little girl who actually turned 21 just this past week, and I became the stay-at-home dad, looking after my daughter because my wife was working full-time to support us. Here I am in graduate school with no income, and so I became an expert in changing diapers and warming up formula and things like that. And thinking to myself, why in the world is this happening to me? Because all of my colleagues, they're going to their first conferences and they're publishing articles and they're going to get great jobs, and here I am, with drool on the front. Some of it not even my own, And so, what was all of this heading toward? Well, what it was heading toward was that I developed this appreciation for parenthood, and I wanted to know more about what it was to be a dad. And here's Bronson Alcott, this quixotic, education-obsessed man who has a daughter who is, very verbally gifted. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is my book. I'm the quixotic, education-crazed guy with a daughter, and I'm just going to write a book that's going to show me something about fatherhood that I don't know. I'm going to use my own experiences to kind of read between the lines of the diaries and the journals, and that's really how I became a biographer. I would not be here, I wouldn't be doing any of this if it were not for family and for that personal connection. But to make an already very long story short, I'm with you, Ron, in that I'm a frustrated novelist too. I would love to write soaring works of original fiction, but I can't come up with characters and plot, right? But you agree with me that there's something that happens when you're in an archive and you see the letters and the journals, and all of a sudden you can tell the story. And so I know that I've heard Stacy speak many times, and she's fond of saying that a biographer is a novelist under oath. I think that's probably true of all of us, that we just want to tell stories and we want to connect with humanity, which is something that obviously Phil knows a lot about. Last thing I want to say before we get into the main part of the program, you said you hope that your students would never forget the person you study. I am positive they will never forget the person they study with. So, anyway.
Thank you. So that's very interesting. You all did you want to be a frustrated novelist? Or did you want to be a novelist? Nobody wants to be a frustrated novelist. Except the guys I worship, who I mentioned before already. It's very interesting to now tiptoe into this subject. And I hope I don't sound inane, but what is the real difference between fiction and nonfiction? The difference, of course, is that nonfiction is true, allegedly, and we try to be as accurate as we can. That's part of our work. But what is it that you wrestle with when you have your documents and you have your letters and you have your interviews? Not you with Cleopatra, but and whatever else you have. How do you construct this in a way that feels true? That's true not just in the facts, but in the whole experience of reading it. Yes, you can talk now.
Thank you. Well, I think you want to draw on the novelistic experience, or at least the novelistic, insight that we all have. The problem is that you're doing it with your hands tied behind your back because, of course, you have only, I think anyway, your material with which to work. So although you might like to say what someone looks like, if you don't know what he or she looks like, you're pretty much stymied in describing their entrance into a room. So you're essentially writing your way, at least I find to be, you're writing your way around the holes in the material, and you're going wherever the material takes you, which is not necessarily where the narrative would take you if you had your druthers. I feel like everyone else is writing poetry. We're having to write sestinas. I mean, there's something, you're so much more cramped by the constraints of the material, and it's your job to, somehow arrange for a kind of comb over where nobody notices the holes in the, in the material, and nobody sort of, nobody knows that Cleopatra didn't have a childhood because Lord knows we don't know what it consisted of. So
That's quite a gap.
Well, let me hold that. I have my own.
Yeah, Ron, tell us.
No, I think that when you're writing biography, there are basically two things that are going on every day. One is building and one is architecture. The readers like to, talk and respond to the architecture, but basically what you're doing, it's brick upon brick. You're laying out a chronology. That's the first thing that you have to do, is to master an enormous, number of facts, present them. I always say when all else fails, you can fall back on chronology, which is what we do. But I think that what really makes it come alive is that you take that chronology and then you build a structure, a kind of scaffolding of themes and observations around it, and that's where biography is a highly subjective thing. I mean, this panel is called, Is Biography True? In fact, biography is a very human, it's a very subjective enterprise. There is no truth that we're going for. We're kind of really presenting our truth and our observations about the character. So it becomes a sort of approximation of the truth. It's a never-ending process. One of my favorite quotes about history is the Dutch historian Peter Gale said that history is an argument without end. Well, biography is an argument without end. And one thing that I've learned over the years is never, for my biographies or anyone's biographies, I never use the word definitive, which is a very, very dangerous word. I'm content if my publisher wants to call it authoritative. That's very flattering. And authoritative means that you've kind of mastered the available facts. You've scoured all of the archives and the research. But the word definitive always implies that you have settled the question of this person's life for once and for all. Whereas, in fact, I feel that biography is this it's a collective enterprise. It's a communal enterprise. You're adding to a long kind of, history of people writing about this subject. And even if you feel that you've had the last word about this subject, sure shooting, you'll wake up one morning and there in the New York Times you feel that you have done this person forever. There is a fresh biography that purports to have new things to say and is kind of disputing what you had to say about this. So it's a collective enterprise and it's an open-ended one.
One of the things that I love about it most is that you can't have the last word. And in fact, it's a big mistake if you are writing a biography to think that you're going to put all of the conversations to rest. It's a much better ambition to start a conversation and to get people asking new questions. That's how the genre and how the enterprise really stays alive. I was going to argue a little bit with something that James said about fiction not being true and nonfiction being true, because I think there's an odd sense in which fiction is truer, and here's where I'm going with that. We can all agree that in The Great Gatsby, Myrtle Wilson gets killed by a car being driven by Daisy Buchanan. There's no way of impeaching that because there is one text that is authoritative that says that that happened. Okay? Whereas when you're trying to recapture the past and when you're trying to write something that is allegedly nonfiction, you want, as you say, to come to the closest approximation possible of what actually did happen. But what actually did happen is 99% inaccessible, right? Because the documents that you're working with are already a massive edit of the three-dimensional experience as it was lived. And much as we would love to return to the past, there's a sense in which a moment stops being true at the moment that it stops being a moment. Yeah, and after that, it's just recollection and what's written down or what is reported, and it's inherently unstable and unreliable. So what do you do with that? You read as many sources as you possibly can. You retrace the steps of previous biographers. You visit the places if you can. And yet still at that point, you can't be sure that even what you behold with your own two eyes is a true representation of what things were like at the time that you're writing about. I'll just give a quick case in point. We can get to the next question. But when I was writing my first book, Eden's Outcasts, I went to Concord, Massachusetts, where the Alcotts lived, in order to get a sense of the physical ground. And you can do that fairly well in Concord because it's still very pastoral and a lot of the old buildings are still there. But I was looking at what kinds of trees are there, what kinds of birds. There are cardinals in the tree. How wonderful. I'll use that as a detail in the book. I'll write about the cardinals flitting through the trees in Concord. The book comes out, it's in hardcover, I get an email from an irate ornithologist. And that irate ornithologist says, "Cardinals did not come to Concord until the 20th century. You, sir, are a fraud." And so I didn't account for climate change. Okay? And the fact that the ranges of birds differ depending on what century you're talking about. What can you do in that situation? The only thing I could do was to write back to him and thank him profusely and fix it in the paperback. And it's fixed in the paperback. But invariably, you can be absolutely sure of a detail and then discover that your sureness was founded on sand.
The problem is it's never the detail you thought it was that you're wrong about.
Right. That's a terrifying story, John. Completely has a chilling effect. But anyway, say you do get what we call the facts, which I could dispute, but if the whole idea of, but if you get the facts right, then where are you in this very subtle and fraught issue of the mind of your subject? What can you say about that? You can't just say that talk about the birds. They'll want to know about the people. And where are you with that?
Sometimes you're lost. I mean, why does anybody? Ideally, you hope for the diaries or the letters. I had a similar case where I had promised the publisher I would write my book on the Nabokovs based on their correspondence, only to discover that we only have one side of the correspondence. And then I made multiple trips to Switzerland to try to find the other side of the correspondence every time papers turned up, and of course they never turned up. My greatest nightmare is that today they will now turn up. But even in a diary or an autobiography, you're not necessarily dealing with your truth, especially if it's a published autobiography. And I guess I would probably cite Benjamin Franklin as my favorite example of that. I mean, we have from Franklin's autobiography his sort of Dickensian entry into Philadelphia as a 17-year-old runaway. And he, writes this sort of archetypal scene in which he arrives in Philadelphia to make his fortune with his 2 puffy rolls that he buys under his arms, and his future wife just happens to be on the scene watching him go by. They weren't yet going to meet for several years. But if you actually look in the Franklin archives, you notice that Franklin arrived in Philadelphia at night, which was an unlikely time to be buying fresh-baked goods and walking around Philadelphia with them under your arm. And there are a lot of things about Franklin's autobiography that are rather suspect, like the fact that it is an ode to diligence in industry, but it's unfinished. I mean, there are all kinds. There are all kinds of things that you might want to think twice about it. This is a book which is written with a tongue wedged firmly in the cheek. So here you have this brilliant, really seminal autobiography, and you can't really take it at its word either. I don't think I answered your question. I think I just made it worse.
You just answered it. You answered some other questions. It's very entertaining, so that's okay. You don't need to answer.
No, I've often thought that biographical subjects, they fall into one of two camps. There are those people who seem to live in order to, please and delight their future biographers. They save all of their correspondence. They're constantly keeping journals. They're very verbal. They're recording everything. And then there are those people who live to baffle and frustrate and madden their biographers. And I invariably seem to write about people in the second group, even though the people I've written about, these are sort of very well-documented lives. All the people I've written about have struck me as very, very closed personalities. Even Alexander Hamilton, whom I think was arguably the most verbal personality who ever lived. In fact, Hamilton was dead by the age of 49. He left behind 32 thick volumes of papers. In fact, the editor at Columbia University Press, Harold Surratt, used to joke that he wanted to dedicate the volumes to Aaron Burr, without whose cooperation, the project would never have been completed. And yet it's amazing. Here was this person at the drop of a hat. He could write, perfectly, worded 10,000-word memo, literally overnight, on any conceivable subject. Yet he was very, very secretive character. Here was someone who spent the entire first third of his life in the Caribbean. In there, I could only find one sentence in the 32 volumes that referred to the first third of his life. So he's kind of chattering away about almost any abstract, topic he would tell you. So the people that I've written about have been very, very closed. And, there have been moments where I felt sorry for myself. Why did I pick these people, who were sort of born to frustrate me? But actually, I find that it's made it much, much more interesting. I guess that it's the thrill of the hunt. That if someone is kind of opening, himself or herself up to you, it's sort of less interesting than someone who at every turn, every time you spy them, they're turning the corner out of sight.
Yeah. There's a lot of inspired guesswork that goes on, particularly with trying to probe the inner processes of a mind, because I would hazard that none of us ever creates a transcript of what we're thinking from moment to moment. And so there is this kind of inner person who's forever inaccessible. I've been recently reading some of the work of Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., the poet and the author of Autocrat at the Breakfast Table. And he says when you're having a conversation with someone, you're actually having a conversation with three people at once. You're having a conversation with the person who is actually who they are, but basically, Holmes says only God knows who that is. And he says it in a very literal way. And then there's the person that the person you're talking to thinks that they are. That's number two. And then third is the person you think you're talking to. And they're all different, okay? And so even the most simple conversation becomes very crowded very quickly because there are three of you, there are three of them, and the 9 possible permutations of connection, and it just gets a little bit ridiculous. I've been fortunate in the 2 books that I've written thus far, in that both Bronson Alcott and Margaret Fuller were obsessive chroniclers of their thoughts almost to the utmost degree that's humanly possible. Bronson Alcott, people say Bronson Alcott never did anything, is because he was writing everything down. And in fact, he says in his journals, I find that I cannot both write my life and live my life. And it's fortunate for people who have an interest in the Alcotts that there's so much about that he did record, and he kept scrapbooks of everything that happened, and so the records are extraordinarily rich. And then Margaret Fuller also has this very rich interior life that she puts principally into her letters. Her journals are more fragmentary, but at the end of the day, I think that what we try to do is to represent our subjects both in the ways in which they are exceptional, in which they differ from the rest of us, but also the ways in which we're similar. How can I relate to this person who happened to be the first Secretary of the Treasury or the Empress of Egypt? But at the same time, to understand the exceptionalness, you do the best you can.
Can I add? Can I just add one thing? You know, I think that the people are constantly hiding and obfuscating, even in their writings, even if the writings pretend to be very confessional. But truth will out, and I feel very strongly that people will reveal themselves. They can't help but reveal themselves. And I always tell this story. When I decided to do the biography of John D. Rockefeller, for the first time I had unrestricted access to Rockefeller's papers, and I was constantly running up to Picantico, a place called the Rockefeller Archive Center, and I would spend 3 days a week up there. And there were tens of thousands of letters that Rockefeller wrote as the head of Standard Oil. A typical Rockefeller letter when he was running Standard Oil. Dear sir, read yours of the 26th, would recommend that you proceed with all due caution. Signed, John D. Rockefeller. There were never any, proper nouns. He was always describing things in this very kind of glancing and indirect way. And I realized that he was writing every single letter as if it might someday fall into the hands of an investigating committee or a prosecuting attorney. So anyway, I remember one night I was, after another very frustrating day at the archives, because here I felt I had unrestricted access to his papers, and I was expecting that I would find one explosive, revelation after another, and I was just coming up dry. He was baffling me, day after day, letter after letter. And I was describing this situation to my wife, and I was saying, this was a terrible mistake to do this book. This man is completely closed and impenetrable. And I started describing the way that he wrote. He was directing what was the largest business empire in the world through all of these 2 and 3 little sentence letters. I was getting angrier and angrier, and I looked across the table at my wife, who was smiling. And I said, what are you smiling? I've just made this catastrophic mistake doing this book. And she said to me, what you're describing is absolutely fascinating. She said, you're kind of trying to look around him. She said, the story is right in front of your eyes. The story is of a man who was so smart and so secretive that he could run this worldwide empire through all of these kind of, winks and hints and cues. She said that you're kind of looking for a more conventional tycoon. I had written about J.P. Morgan, someone who would roar and bluster, and Rockefeller was not like that at all. But she said to me, you found a true original, but you're kind of not seeing the originality is right in front of your face. And that was actually a very, very interesting letter, because in fact Rockefeller was telling me more about himself through all of these cryptic little notes that he was writing. Then, of course, what happened, the way that the archives were structured, is that the incoming letters were in one place and then his outgoing letters were in another. As I began to match up the incoming letters with his outgoing letters, there might be, for instance, a 10-page letter saying we bribed the entire Maryland legislature to get through this pipeline, and then Rockefeller would write, received yours for the 26th, proceed with all due caution, signed John D. Rockefeller. It gave a whole different spin to it.
Let me ask you, yes. So let's say, as responsible biographers who have spent many years in the craft, that you assemble all this information and you've gotten it right, except for the cardinals. But what about the unconscious of your subject? Can you say he felt? Can you say that you definitively know some aspect of this character's emotions that you can't possibly know?
Okay, Stacy's been very brave, taking the first stab at all of these questions. It's coming rapid fire. Okay. So I'll do the best I can. Something that I think every aspiring biographer asks is, how much can I rely on saying must have or might have? Or exactly, how much can you speculate? And there's almost always some kind of way around it, and sometimes it involves sort of lawyering your way around the language a little bit. For instance, when Bronson and Louisa May Alcott are saying farewell to the youngest Alcott sister, May Alcott, she's on her way to Europe in hopes of becoming a famous artist, and The entries in the journals gave me the date, they gave me the name of the ship, they gave me the color of the hat that May was wearing, and they didn't say a word about what either Bronson or Louisa were thinking. And it's this dramatic moment because it's the last time they're ever going to see her, though they don't know that yet. And I wanted really to do something with it and bring it alive, and there was nothing in the record that really would support it. And so what I ended up writing was I said something like, actually I just happened to have it here, so I can get the actual words for you. Available still in better bookstores. But anyway, okay. Yes. Bronson and Louisa escorted her as far as the dock. Prey to all the throat-constricting feelings that came with parting, they stood and watched as their blue-clad dear girl waved her handkerchief and the ship proceeded toward the horizon. Now, I don't know that they were feeling throat-constricting emotions, but they were certainly prey to them, and therefore I felt justified in putting that in. Okay, so that's a very, okay. So Jim cries foul. Jim cries foul. And yet, counselor, how can you impeach what I've said? You know, that anybody saying farewell to their child would be prey to those emotions, whether they felt them or not. Oh.
Dwight MacDonald, the fabled critic of another era, edited my first book for me. I was very lucky to have him. And whenever I tried to I guess an unfair word would be to say obfuscate some fact or insist that someone was having a throat-clearing moment, he would write in the margin, weasel. I love that. It's rung in my ears ever since.
I used to be a lawyer, so I claim professional privilege. But also on the subject of the mind and the unconscious mind, I had an advantage with Louisa May Alcott because I was writing about a writer of fiction. And fiction can be extremely revelatory, not necessarily of the facts of a person's life, but certainly of their mindset. You know, certainly, you know, Stacy, you've written about Vladimir Nabokov. It doesn't, you know, there's nothing to suggest that Nabokov was Humbert in disguise or anything like that. And yet, by reading what Nabokov wrote, you do get a sense of his playfulness, of his delight in a sort of obfuscation that reveals and conceals at the same moment. And what I found with Louisa May Alcott was that she revealed herself sometimes in ways that she wasn't necessarily completely aware of. The book that she said was closest to her heart and most representative sort of her is a lesser-known book called Moods, in which the heroine is essentially bipolar. And lies in the dark with the curtains drawn for weeks at a time, and then all of a sudden has bursts of energy and does all these death-defying things. And then I found out that Louisa had a sort of practice in her writing where she would just work like crazy for 7 weeks and not eat and not sleep and and still have excess energy to burn off running, and then she would collapse and be able to do nothing for months. It's like, aha, yeah. But I never in the book said that she was definitely bipolar, but I tried out all the evidence from both the factual sources and from the clues in her fiction, and I think was able to make a fairly reasonable case that this was someone who was at least on the bipolar spectrum, whether it was full-blown or not. So it's a joy and a delight to work on someone who has written fiction, because it does give you this understanding of state of mind that sometimes even the journals and the letters may not.
So I've had proven to my satisfaction that biography is not true. And Philip, did you want to ask some questions? You have.
It's early yet.
Is it early? Okay, then sit tight, and I'll ask some.
I want to hear a little more from you before I ask a question.
All right. Okay, I have many more things to ask.
Can I just build on something John said, Jim? I just had two sort of, and I think Ron had something too. I just had two sort of contradictory things to say to what you said. The first is that one of the rare advantages you have as a biographer, although you do not have your subject psychiatric sessions normally, is that you have a perspective on his or her life that he does not have on his life. So that, for example, when he writes the same love letter to a different woman 13 years later, even though he is the greatest prose stylist of the 20th century, you begin to know something about him that he probably didn't realize about himself. So there is a certain added understanding, I think, that you do bring to the table, because you can see him repeating himself or repeating his fictions or his non-fictions over and over again. And on the other hand, I would say, and I'm suddenly thinking of the Nabokovs again, which I haven't in a while, there's a hilarious moment in Andrew Field's 1977 biography where he has the Nabokovs returning to Ithaca, New York, after Lolita has become this worldwide sensation. They get off the train, the Erie Lackawanna in Ithaca, which is in the middle of nowhere, and with their 29 suitcases, Nabokov puts his hand in the air and yells, "Porter!" And of course, there isn't a porter for hundreds of miles around. And if you pull the camera back a minute, you see that the story comes from Morris Bishop, who was one of Nabokov's Cornell colleagues, who was on the train platform when the Nabokovs arrived. And when the Nabokovs heard this story, they said, "Hilarious, hilarious. We did that for Morris's benefit." So, were they acting, or who's telling the truth here? And there is, I think, a Heisenberg uncertainty principle with biography in terms of who is your source, and does the biographer's presence in the frame change the frame somewhat too? So, there's that piece of it, I think, that one always bears in mind, along with the context.
How do you know if your subject is lying? I mean, that's...
You always assume they are, I think.
In fact, I was about to say something that actually leads into your next question. As I was saying before, all the people that I've written about would be, if they were alive today, complete strangers to the analytic couch. They would run the other direction from any therapist. And I'm now doing Ulysses S. Grant, who falls into that category completely. And when I first started working on the book, Grant, of course, wrote famous memoir, and I ran into a wise guy friend who just kind of stopped me dead in my tracks. He said, "Ron, how can you write a great biography about somebody who wrote a great autobiography?" And I have to admit, I was taken aback. Of course, Grant's memoir is not an autobiography. He omits several small things like his two-term presidency, so it doesn't really purport to be a complete life. It's mostly a military memoir, really mostly a military memoir of the Civil War, to a certain extent the Mexican War, and with his childhood and other pre-Civil War events sketched in very lightly. But for days I walked around thinking about that comment. How do you write a great biography about someone who's written a great memoir? And then what happened? So I then opened up the book one day, and I just started checking off in the margin the silences and the evasions. And I realized that in a strange kind of way, my book was going to be a mirror image of Grant's memoirs, because every place that he went silent, went missing, was exactly where I was going to zero in. So, for instance, you probably all know the story, in St. Louis in the 1850s went through this terrible period of failure, to the point where he was selling firewood on the street corners of St. Louis. Well, in one sentence, he jumps over, I forget if it was 3 or 4 years of failure in one sentence. And so basically what we're doing is that we're kind of homing in on exactly the places where the person doesn't want us to direct their attention. And then conversely, there's places where they're, dying to have us concentrate, we glance away.
Have anything to add?
I was just going to say that would be like Ben Franklin's illegitimate son who doesn't appear in his autobiography, to whom it is addressed.
If you agree that that many of these sources are flawed and uncertain, how do you construct a narrative that takes account of that while at the same time being authoritative in your own right? I mean, when we spend so much time on these projects that we really end up feeling that we know, and we do know a great deal, but there's always this sense, Henry James, never say you know the last word about any human heart. There's always a sense that you have to build in the incompletion somehow, that as you said, definitive is an illusion, but also even the sense of really trying to claim authority is difficult.
Do you want to? No, I really think that the way that we get to know people in biography is the same way that we get to know people in life. That is, what I try to do. I think what most biographers try to do is to give you an enormous number of impressions. To give you dozens, maybe hundreds of anecdotes, hundreds of people commenting. And at first it seems like a cacophony of voices because these people are often saying very contradictory things. And yet we, as the reader, if the biography is well done, we will come up with a very kind of sharp and vivid portrait of this person. It's kind of counterintuitive because we're getting so many contradictory impressions of this character. But the same way that in life, we're seeing someone day after day, every day, we see them, they may be in a different mood, we see a different side of them, we're hearing many different people give us many different perspectives on the same character, and yet when we're asked what someone is like, we will have a very strong sense. We have somehow managed to filter out from all of these various impressions a coherent sense of this personality. And I think that biography works in a similar kind of way by osmosis. Yes, we're giving the narrative. Yes, we're kind of, providing a running commentary as we're getting the narrative. But basically, the reader is kind of extracting from this abundance of often contradictory information a portrait that, if it's well done, I think will end up being coherent. And one thing I always say to people is to sort of go out of your way to present contradictory information. Far from confusing the reader, that will actually clarify things for the reader because that's the way that real life is. We think we know about someone and then we learn something that completely contradicts what we understood, and we make that adjustment to our sense of them, but indeed we have a strong sense of their personality. People are just very, very complicated, and I think that biography should reflect that.
That's nice. That's nice.
And another thing that we're always doing is we're narrating change. I think that ties into what you were saying, that we're not talking about a static person at a particular moment. We're not providing just one snapshot. We need to give you a film, and using contradictory perspectives is certainly one way of doing that. My second book was called The Lives of Margaret Fuller. With very conscious and very upmost in my consciousness, the fact that the person I was describing was a person of extraordinary complexity and someone who was incredibly protean and had to, in part because she was a woman in the 19th century with limited opportunities because of her sex, had to reinvent herself steadily every couple of years. And one of the challenges of writing about her, in fact, was that the biography of Margaret Fuller was written by three of her friends, including Ralph Waldo Emerson, and none of these people had actually known her during the last 6 years of her life because she had traveled to Rome, and she, in Rome, becomes a completely different person. She drops transcendentalism, she drops so many of her influences, and really tries to reconstruct herself in an even more radical way, and that transformation was utterly invisible to the people who thought that they knew her best and knew her well enough to write her first biography. So it's absolutely true that you can never run out of, or you can never say to yourself, I've got enough perspectives now. Anything that you're able to add that adds just an iota of scintilla of information is going to add, once again, a sort of life and useful instability to the subject.
I just want to say that I would say that context is so incredibly helpful as well, because for me, taking Ben Franklin from America to France was turning Ben Franklin to another side. I mean, I think we all think of him as a man who always had something to say and was tremendously verbose and incredibly quotable. Who knew he was actually quite taciturn? And that didn't show up for me until I sort of switched and put him in a different world where suddenly what was referred to as his kind of, stubborn, his unwillingness to take a stand in America became in France his sublime taciturnity, because in France nobody listened to anybody. So the idea that someone actually listened was shocking. And he's constantly described in reports in Paris as someone who would listen to you if you came to talk to him. That was partly because his French was bad. But again, it's taking the figure out of the context to some extent to see better what either he didn't want you to see or what we don't normally see.
So, Philip, I failed to break these people despite my intensive questioning. They're still saying, they're stonewalling and saying it's true. So why don't you ask a question?
I'm going to ask one question, and then Anne is going to ask one question, and then you'll ask the audience for some questions. How about that?
That sounds good.
All right, so my question I'd like to throw into the mix is, I said earlier that I'm interested. I love biography. I read biography. I depend on it for my work. But behind biography is the life itself. And isn't it true that a biographer of all persons must have a sense of humility before the life, so that you're beware of imposing your narrative scope upon a life that didn't really reflect that in itself? That's actually not my question. My question is that you spend years on some of these books that you write. And that's going to have an effect upon you as a person, as a human being. Do you ever have the feeling of actually communing with a life, developing almost a kind of human connection, almost as if you knew them in some way? And do you trust feelings of subjectivity of that kind? Or do you see them as the enemy and you're always striving for objectivity?
Okay, I feel as if I know the Alcotts better than I know my own family, because I don't read my own family's diaries. You know, the Alcotts, interestingly enough, did read each other's diaries. It was kind of required in the family that you pass them around. And interestingly enough, the only one who didn't go along with that was Lizzie Alcott, who became Beth March in Little Women, and she was the quietest one to begin with. But she put up a wall and said, "No, my diary is mine," and they actually did respect that. But and so the question was about humility, but also this question of communing. Actually, I think that that writing about the people that I've written about has helped me commune with living people better. It's given me, sort of through the scholarly understanding of human motivation and strength and frailty, I like to think that I've developed a deeper appreciation for those qualities in the people I actually know. And I think that I thank heavens that I got to become a biographer, because I think it's made me, perhaps a slightly more emotionally porous person and better able to absorb the feelings and the ideas and the hopes and thoughts of the people around me.
I think that a biographer has to be careful to avoid a certain kind of vanity, because you're writing about this figure, and that you're spending more time, as John was saying, with this figure than any, friend or family member. You have to avoid the temptation of imagining that you're kind of hobnobbing with these people, that you're suddenly on their level, because you're not. They wouldn't be worth writing about if you were on their level. The whole point is that they're, so much, greater and more interesting than you could ever be. I find with all of the books, they've had a special meaning. I mean, one that, because was my most recent, is on my mind when I was writing George Washington. My wife for 27 years died, and in that state of mourning, I found that there was something about Washington's strength and perseverance that was an inspiration to me. So I think that each of the books has a meaning. But I think also just one other thing, because I know Philip has done such an extraordinary job with his Center for Transformative Lives, and I think that the basic idea of the center is that these inspirational lives, and they are. But I think that we read biography for two reasons, or we should read biography for two reasons. One is inspirational stories. The other is cautionary tales. They're not always people to emulate. They all have flaws. There are kind of warning signs in all of these stories that I think that we should take heed. Because I find that sometimes I find readers, in terms of reacting to something that I've written, they'll actually seem disappointed by my discussion of flaws in the person, and they'll actually evaluate the book by how wonderful, or flawless this character is or isn't, and I think that that's wrong. And I think that the purpose of biography in terms of the cautionary tale is arguably as important as that of the inspirational story.
And I think the cautionary tale sometimes makes for the better book too, because it's like the airplane crash is always made for better flying in my first book. I think there is something of the extended seance about it, though, no matter what we all want to admit or not. I mean, I think you do things for your subject that you might not even do for your children, and you go to the places that they went, and you read the books they read, and you drink their favorite drinks, and you try to learn their favorite sports, and you may want to learn their languages. I mean, I do think there is a certain amount of crawling into the skin, which I kind of love, the burrowing, so far as it's possible. It isn't quite so possible with a Hellenistic queen, to burrow into the skin of the subject. But I think you can only take it so far, and at the risk of revealing something I shouldn't reveal, I remember with my first book once, I had a dream where Saint-Exupéry came to me in my dream and said, "I won't reveal myself to you unless you spend more time with your children."
And
Wow.
I have a related question, and that is this. There are figures who command multiple biographies, sometimes dozens of them.
We're all writing about Steve Jobs.
Exactly. And then there are figures that, once a biography has been written, that's pretty much it. That's enough. There might be, side lights or low lights to be revealed. But what is it that makes for a character, a figure who biographers have to come back to? And why do they come back to those characters? Is it because the current moment demands some new revelation about that character? Is it because the figure somehow speaks to the biographer or to the time? What makes for a great biographical figure?
Well, I think, unfortunately, one of the things that determines the number of biographies written about an individual is just how many people in the street recognize the name. And just commercially, it's more sensible to try to say something about Abraham Lincoln than it is to say about Jose Marti. And Jose Marti could use a really, really good biography, I'm told. But I seem to recall somebody is working on one. But I think it's important to try to resist the pressures of the marketplace, and I would be terribly surprised if anybody up here or anybody in this room wrote about someone just because they're popular and they can stand to have dozens of biographies on them. I hope that one chooses one's topic, one's subject, out of something very deeply internal and a desire to understand the experiences and struggles of a particular individual, because that person somehow just matters to you, if you get a good contract for that book, fantastic. If it sells, fabulously wonderful. If you get a couple prizes, great. But I'll tell you something very interesting, and that goes back to when I had just finished writing Eden's Outcast. It had actually come out and was starting to get some reviews. And Publishers Weekly came out with a review that was really kind of skunky. And I was angry, practically. If we had had a cat, I would never abuse an animal. We'd be kicking it around the apartment just in disgust. And my daughter, who was then 13, sat me down and she said, "Dad, you did not write your book so that Publishers Weekly would like it. You wrote it because you had something to say that no one else was ever going to say if you didn't say it. And it's the best advice I've ever had as a writer, and I treasure it to this day."
Now, we haven't talked much just about the choice of subject, which is far and away the most important choice that a biographer makes. I always say, whenever I speak to writing students, I say it's a little bit like marriage. You choose the right person and nothing can go wrong. You choose the wrong person and nothing can go right. So much flows out of that one decision. I mean, I think that, you decide to write a biography of someone either because you feel that you can create a fresh portrait, or because you have fresh sources of information about the person. But another dimension that I've always looked for in biography is I want this person to represent some big movement or trend or phenomenon in American life, since I've written mostly American history. And I've been lucky in terms of having people whom I think did represent something. I never wanted to just write a colorful yarn about someone. I find that very often, after doing a speech or a signing, someone will come up and say, "Mr. Chernow, I have your next book." And they will tell me a story that is the most astounding story I have ever heard in my life about anyone. And they can see I'm just kind of sitting there dazzled by this tale. And so they said, "Is that going to be your next book?" And I say, "No." And they say, "Why not? You're saying this is the most unbelievable story you've ever heard." And I said, "Well, I'm not clear what the meaning of this story is. It would be tremendously entertaining to write, and I'm sure tremendously entertaining to read, but it doesn't have that extra dimension." I think, to answer your question, I think when you look at these figures where there have been many, many books written about them, it was because those lives added up to something much more than an interesting life, that it was a creation of something in the society that was going on that they were a central part of.
David Herbert Donald once said something to me as well when I said something about there being no more Lincoln materials, and he said there are never any new materials, there are only new questions. And I think there are people we just come back to. I mean, I don't know how many Washingtons have been done since.
Well, I mean,
there are more
there
Cleopatras.
There were 900 biographies of Washington when I perpetrated number 901. But I'll tell you an interesting story just apropos of Lincoln. I remember years back when I was doing the Rockefeller book, I was working in the University of Chicago library, and on the ground floor there was a beautiful glass enclosed room full of books. And I said to one of the librarians, I said, "What's in that room?" And she said, "Oh, we bought a very famous collection of someone who collected books either exclusively about Lincoln or in which Lincoln figured prominently in the book." So I said, out of curiosity, "How many books are in that room?" And she said 45,000.
So, Philip, now, do we have time for a question or two?
We do. We should go to our reception at by 7:30. So we have
okay.
about 10 minutes, and
Okay.
then I'll dismiss us after that.
Oh, good. Okay.
Jim, is it appropriate if panel members get to ask questions of other panel members? I know
then I could
that's a
just sit
terrible
here.
usurpation.
No, that's okay. I have other things to do. I think it's great.
Okay.
Why should I do all the work? Okay, so we don't have one of those people who run around with the microphone and put it in your face, and so you have to project. Oh, we don't have. Yes, so project, and I will repeat the question. Yes, I know what to do. Yes.
I was wondering if you were going to mention, though, this issue of whether biography is true or not can be very contentious, particularly in my field, where there happens to be a number of biographies with a myth embedded in them, and I have written my own biography to undo that if I possibly could. And this happens to be Johannes Brahms, the composer. What I found to be essential in revising this biography is the use of official documents, and that is something that you were talking about, that people have their own take on things and you can't rely on people's memory and all that. That's true. But there are official documents which can be extremely helpful in recreating a life, and I imagine you must make use of that all the time.
Did people hear this question? Oh, good. You heard. Yes. So official documents, but we have talked a little bit about that, haven't we? But sure, add what you wish. I mean, this is part of.
This gets back to the issue of asking the right questions, because many of them can only be answered not by reading a previous biography, which is a very common way of writing biography, not good biography, but by digging in the archives.
Well, I'm sure you've all done a great deal of that.
Your point well taken, and I know what it's like to have to deal with myth. I would say about official archives only this. There's an enormous amount in the State Department archive. There's an enormous file on Saint-Exupéry, who spent the war years in New York as a foreign national. Almost everything in that file is wrong. So it's written by a bunch of 22-year-olds who were just out of Harvard and were working for the CIA and didn't really understand anything whatsoever about European politics or about the fall of France, and pretty much everything they wrote is completely off base. So you can read Saint-Exupéry as being part of any number of political organizations that he was not part of. And I think that's true of any number of, when Franklin's living in France, there are two sets of newspapers. There's the official French press and there's the unofficial French press. Everything written in the official French press is propaganda. It's wrong. So, again, but I'm saying you take the documentation for what it's worth as well as the myths. Obviously some things more so. I think we all have said we've tended to doubt diaries to some extent. Personal correspondence is probably less so. I just think a certain amount of skepticism is always a good sort of marching tool.
No, I've written about these very, very well documented lives. In Hamilton, there were 32 thick volumes. Grant, 32 thick volumes. Case of Washington, almost 70 of a projected 90 plus volumes. Just a couple of things, about that. These are such great scholarly feats, the creation of these new editions of papers. Some of them take up to 40 or 50 years to do. Unfortunately, what has happened is that I think that the creation of these elaborate new editions, which are so marvelous, they're just feasts of scholarship. In the case of Washington, it was about, I forget, it was 150,000 documents. So we know much more about George Washington than Martha knew. We have that much information. I think, unfortunately, what's happened is, in a curious way, they've acted as a deterrent, because people who want to do, an authoritative biography of these figures look at the shelf and they say, oh, for starters, I have to go through all, 70 volumes of Washington or 32 volumes of Grant. And frankly, most people don't have the time or maybe the stamina or inclination to do it. So it's been wonderful, but also I think something of a deterrent just in terms of swamping people. But you mentioned the myths, because this is something that we've all had to deal with, and I think it's very humbling if you're a biographer, the persistence of myth, because we feel that our job is to almost like scrape away these barnacles, these myths that cling to the subject's lives. But we all find what happens is that we scrape away the myths, and the myths go on because they appeal to someone. I remember when I was going around, doing publicity about George Washington, I would start out by saying to the audience that for most of them, everything they knew about George Washington was a myth. The cherry tree was a myth. The fact that he wore a wig was a myth. The fact that he was 6'3" was a myth. And I could see the audience, this kind of growing panic in the audience that, oh my God, I don't really know anything about, the father of the country. And that is true. Almost everything that they knew was myth. But the three myths that I just mentioned, have been debunked by many biographers before I came along, but we all seem rather powerless to touch them because they appeal to some psychological need in people. So it's very sobering.
Yeah. In Moby Dick, Melville's narrator Ishmael makes a plea for time, strength, cash, and patience. And I think to be the perfect biographer, you'd have to have infinite qualities of all four. You'd really almost have to be a god to have all of the knowledge and all of the time and all of the resources to do as thorough a job as you would love to do. And what then happens, since you don't have infinite resources or infinite time, and you have an editor breathing down your neck wanting your next chapters, is that there's a temptation to fall back on other secondary material and to crib maybe a little bit off of what previous biographers have done, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel all the time. But invariably, the attempt to reinvent the wheel is preferable and more rewarding because it gets you to the actual documents. I have an article actually this month in New England Quarterly about a soldier whom Louisa May Alcott tended to when she was a nurse in the Civil War, whom she describes in her journal, very often reprinted, as a 30-year-old Virginia blacksmith. By the utterest happenstance, I was able to find out that, after I wrote this in my biography, Madeline Stern wrote in her biography, every Alcott biographer has called this guy a 30-year-old Virginia blacksmith. He was 21 and he was from Pennsylvania. Okay, and I have an article now in New England Quarterly correcting that problem, that everybody's just gotten in line and said the same thing. And so, you know, it goes to show what? That constantly new information is going to bubble to the surface, that anytime you try to cut a corner, you do so at your own risk, although it's almost impossible not to, simply because we live in a world of limited time and resources. As far as myth goes, I think it's not a terrible thing to print the myth, but just make sure that you have made it clear that it is, right? There's this wonderful story that Julian Hawthorne, Nathaniel Hawthorne's son, told about Louisa May Alcott and how she found out that Little Women was a hit. And it's this thing where she goes to the publisher and there are all these boxes sitting around. She doesn't even know what they are, but she hasn't heard from him. She wants her manuscript back. So she goes to him. She says, "I want my manuscript." He says, "You're Miss Alcott? Why, all of these boxes contain copies of Little Women. You've outsold Uncle Tom's Cabin. You've done the great thing of the century." He jumps over his desk and hugs her. None of it ever happened. It couldn't possibly have happened, and yet it's such a great story that, you know, I put it in and said, Julian Hawthorne says this. It can't possibly be true, but it's so much fun. Here it is. You know, so yeah. I mean, we're also to a degree in the entertainment business, but not to the extent that we would ever, intentionally falsify or make anything up or perpetuate a myth that we knew to be a myth. You know, we do have ethics of some kind. Throat constricting emotions notwithstanding.
One more.
Forgive me, but as a psychologist, I'm going to maintain that every subject you write about changes you. And I'm interested, following up on Philip's question, which subject changed you the most and how?
Okay, well, I think I've already answered that, and it's the Alcotts, and it's because it just showed me a complete different dimension of family and parenthood and understanding of the people dearest to me. And it was a life-changing experience. I could not have written the book if I hadn't had my daughter, and I would not be the same person to my daughter nor she to me if I had not written the book. So that's for me, it's easy to answer.
I think for me it's probably Franklin, interestingly. First of all, it cured me from ever wanting to research a book in France ever again. So that was helpful and saved me a lot of money. But the interesting thing with Franklin, and I think this goes to Anne's question about why we go back to certain subjects again and again, there's almost nothing you can say about Franklin which you can't also contradict. And I mean, this is a man who, founds a fire brigade, but also an insurance company. I mean, everything about him there's a counter statement to. And, again, the verbosity, but he's incredibly taciturn. And it taught me a lot about nuance in life and and nuance in people, and that the many-sidedness of Franklin, which is, I think, utterly, and always going to interest us and pull us back to him, had been a huge lesson for me as a biographer, but also as a human being. Not that I wasn't already slightly nuanced.
Don't hand that to me.
Oh, sorry. Did you have something to say?
No, I never have anything to say. That's fine.
I think for me, Hamilton, although Hamilton was also a humbling experience because I spent 5 years working on Hamilton. I remember before I started the book, I thought I was smart, I thought I was a good writer, I thought I was a fast writer, and then suddenly, I'm in the company of genius every day for 5 years, and I began to feel, oh my God, compared to this guy, I'm a kind of, tongue-tied, dithering idiot, wonder boy who's dashing off all these brilliant speeches and essays and books. I think that kind of when you're in the company of a great mind, it's kind of like you're breathing this oxygen. It's very stimulating. It's sort of very clarifying. You feel that your own mind is, temporarily working at a higher level. I think that the effect wore off after a while, and I kind of went back to being this more ordinary character. But I can remember while I was working the book, I felt that I had this kind of heady sense that I was up there in Hamilton's world.
So I think we have time for just one more.
I was going to say, picking up on something that Stacy said regarding subjects or people not understanding their own lives, and something that Ron said relating to Grant. Curious to any of you as readers have read an autobiography that you felt really was truthful, said the final word, was the kind of work that made any kind of biography by somebody else on that subject superfluous.
Yes, there was. Yeah. Who can think of an autobiography that's true? If it was true, it wouldn't be worth writing.
The one that maybe comes closest for me is Katharine Graham's. Yeah, but it's not necessarily even my favorite autobiography. My favorite autobiography is The Education of Henry Adams, but he leaves gaps all over the place. He leaves a 20-year gap to the time he was married, and so yeah, I love Katharine Graham's because it's so honest and so revelatory and so seemingly at least candid about the suicide of her husband and her having to take over the Washington Post and so forth. But my credo is that there's always something more to be done and more to be said.
I guess I would say that the more artful the autobiography, the more I assume it's art. And therefore, it invites biography. I mean, thinking of Speak Memory, or I'm thinking of Cab at the Door. I mean, the more beautifully done it is, the more elusive is its author. I mean, there is a sort of striptease to it, and that much isn't stripped off. But in answer to your question, something then which you can do no better as a biographer, I would give you this. In Ethel Merman's biography, there's a chapter entitled My Marriage to Ernest Borgnine, and there are 2 blank pages afterwards.
You have one, Ron? Can you up the tone here a little bit? We have Katharine Graham, but Ethel Merman? I'm surprised.
Yeah, I never thought, Stacy. Thank you for mentioning Ethel Merman. An autobiography that I always love, so much that it never dawned on me to want to read a biography of him, was the autobiography of John Stuart Mill, which I guess that I read, at a very impressionable age, at a time when I was trying to feed my own mind with knowledge. And we were talking about cautionary tales. There was definite, warning sign of what happens if you try to over-intellectualize your life.
So, I would like to have the last word, because all I've done is listen to these people, and with the platform and everything, Philip and I did it all. And that is one of my favorite quotes is from Keats, the idea of negative capability that he describes in a letter to his brother. When a man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. So I know I've given this genre of ours a tough time and made you all defend it, but obviously we've all devoted our lives to this, to biography, and we all love it as a form, and we approach it with skepticism, but also with trust. And you are 3 wonderful exemplars of this. So thank you for coming tonight.